The photograph sits in a dusty evidence box, forgotten for over a century. Detective Maria Santos pulls on latex gloves before lifting the aged sepia print from its manila envelope. What she sees makes her breath catch in her throat. 5 men, in bowler hats and wool coats, stand outside Murphy's Tavern on South State Street. Their eyes are cold, their postures defiant. These are the Torino brothers and their associates, photographed just weeks before the bloody Valentine's Day massacre. That would shake Chicago to its core, but it's not the gangsters that make Maria's pulse quicken. In the background, barely visible through the tavern's window, stands a young man with wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook. The face is unmistakable to anyone who knows their FBI history: J. Edgar Hoover. 24 years old and supposedly 300 miles away in Washington, D.C., working as a clerk in the Justice Department's Alien Enemy Bureau. Maria grabs her phone and dials her partner, Detective Ray Coleman. "Ray, you need to get down to the archives, now. I think we just found proof that the official history of American law enforcement is a lie." The photograph was discovered during the renovation of the old Chicago Police Department building. Workers, tearing down a wall, found a hidden cache of evidence from the 1913 Torino investigation, including surveillance photos that were never entered into the official record. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a historian specializing in early 20th century crime, examines the photograph under a magnifying glass. Her hands tremble as she studies the young man's features. "This changes everything we thought we knew about Hoover's early career," she whispers. According to every biography, every government record, Hoover was in Washington that entire winter. He supposedly never set foot in Chicago until 1924, when he was appointed director of the Bureau of Investigation. But the evidence is undeniable. Advanced facial recognition software confirms it with 99.7% accuracy. The young man in the window is J. Edgar Hoover, caught in a moment that history forgot. Maria and Ray begin digging deeper into the archives. What they find is a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of government. Secret memos, coded telegrams, and witness statements that were buried for over a century. The story begins in November 1913. Chicago is drowning in violence. The Torino family controls the South Side rackets with an iron fist, but their empire is crumbling. Rival gangs are moving in, police corruption is rampant, and innocent civilians are caught in the crossfire. Anthony Torino, the family patriarch, sits in his office above the tavern, counting stacks of blood money. At 45, he's survived 3 assassination attempts and countless gang wars. But lately he's been paranoid. Someone is watching him, someone who doesn't belong to any of the usual players in Chicago's criminal underworld. "Boss, there's that kid again," says Vincent Torino, Anthony's younger brother. He points toward the street where a young man in a government-issued coat stands pretending to read a newspaper. Same one who's been hanging around all week. Anthony peers through the blinds. The kid looks like a college boy, all clean-cut and proper. But there's something about his eyes, something calculating and dangerous. "Find out who he is," Anthony orders, "and if he's trouble, make it go away." 3 blocks away, J. Edgar Hoover writes in his notebook. His official assignment is to investigate German sympathizers and potential enemy aliens in Chicago. But Hoover has bigger ambitions. He's convinced that America's criminal organizations pose a greater threat to national security than foreign spies. Working without official authorization, Hoover has spent weeks building a surveillance network in Chicago's underworld. He's cultivated informants, photographed meetings, and documented the intricate web of corruption that connects gangsters, police, and politicians. His boarding house room is wallpapered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. Lines of red string connect faces to crimes, crimes to politicians, politicians back to criminals. It's a map of American corruption, and Hoover is determined to expose it all, but someone has been watching the watcher. Teresa Gianelli works as a waitress at Murphy's Tavern, but her real job is much more dangerous. She's Anthony Torino's eyes and ears, reporting on customers, eavesdropping on conversations, and occasionally slipping poison into the coffee of men who ask too many questions. She's also falling in love with the young government agent who doesn't know that his cover was blown on day one. He's different from the others, she tells her sister Maria during their weekly confession at St. Mary's Church. He actually believes he can change things, that he can make the world better. Men like that are the most dangerous, Maria warns. They'll sacrifice anyone for their cause. But Teresa can't stop herself. When she sees Vincent Torino and two other men following Hoover down Wells Street, she makes a choice that will haunt her for the rest of her life. The confrontation happens. In an alley behind the Palmer House Hotel, Vincent corners Hoover with a knife while his associates block the exits. But Hoover isn't the soft government clerk they expected. "You boys are making a mistake," Hoover says calmly, his hand moving slowly toward his coat. "I'm here on official business." "Your business is about to end permanent-like," Vincent snarls, raising the knife. That's when Teresa appears at the mouth of the alley. "Vincent, stop! The police are coming!" It's a lie, but it works. Vincent and his men scatter, leaving Hoover alone with the woman who just saved his life. "Why?" Hoover asks. Teresa looks into his eyes and sees something that terrifies her. Not fear or gratitude, but calculation. He's already figuring out how to use this situation to his advantage. "Because someone needs to stop them," she whispers, and in that moment, an unlikely partnership is born. Over the next 3 weeks, Teresa feeds Hoover inside information about the Torino operations. She photographs documents, memorizes conversations, and maps out the family's criminal empire. In return, Hoover promises to protect her when the inevitable reckoning comes. But Anthony Torino is no fool. He's survived this long by trusting no one and suspecting everyone. When a series of police raids disrupts his operations with suspicious precision, he knows he has a traitor in his organization. "Someone's been talking," he tells his inner circle during a secret meeting at the tavern. "Someone close enough to know our business, smart enough to stay hidden, and connected enough to reach the feds." His eyes sweep the room, lingering on each face. When they reach Teresa, she feels her blood turn to ice. "I want everyone investigated," Anthony continues. "Phone records, bank accounts, family connections. Find the rat and bring me their head." The investigation leads nowhere for days. Teresa has been too careful, too clever in covering her tracks. But then Anthony's cousin Sal makes a discovery that changes everything. "Boss, you need to see this," Sal says, bursting into the office with a photograph in his hand. It's the surveillance, a photo that will be found a century later, showing the Torino brothers outside their tavern. But Sal has blown up the background, revealing Hoover's face in startling detail. "That's the government boy who's been sniffing around," Sal explains. "But look at this." He produces another photograph, this one showing Teresa walking with Hoover near the lakefront. They're not touching, barely even looking at each other, but to Anthony's suspicious eyes, their body language tells a story of intimate conspiracy. "Oh, niece," Anthony whispers, his voice filled with hurt and rage. "Blood of my blood, and she betrays us for some pencil-necked federal boy." The next morning, Teresa arrives at work to find the tavern unusually quiet. The regular customers are absent, and even the kitchen staff seems nervous. Anthony sits alone at his usual table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. "Sit down, Teresa," he says without looking up. "We need to talk." She knows it's over, but she sits anyway. Fear has paralyzed her vocal cords. She can barely breathe, let alone speak. Anthony slides the photograph across the table. Teresa's face in profile, Hoover's unmistakable features. The Chicago skyline in the background. "Explain this to me," Anthony says quietly. "Help me understand how my brother's daughter could sell out her own family." Teresa finds her voice. "They killed Mrs. Patterson. She was just trying to buy groceries for her children, and they gunned her down because she witnessed something she shouldn't have seen." "Business," Anthony says with a shrug. "She was pregnant," Teresa screams finally, losing control. "She was 19 years old and pregnant, and you murdered her for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." Anthony's face doesn't change expression, but his hand moves to the gun under his jacket. "Where is he?" Anthony asks. "Your federal boyfriend. Where does he stay?" Teresa lifts her chin defiantly. "I'll never tell you." "You will," Anthony says, pulling out the gun and placing it on the table. "Because if you don't, I'm going to kill every person in this neighborhood until someone gives him up. Starting with your sister Maria and her 3 babies. The boarding house at 127 North Clark Street has seen better days. The wallpaper is peeling, the floorboards creak, and the radiators bang like ghost chains all night long. But it's cheap, discreet, and most importantly, the elderly landlady Mrs. Kowalski minds her own business." Hoover sits at his desk, organizing the evidence he's collected over the past month. Financial records proving police corruption, photographs documenting illegal gambling operations, witness statements detailing murder and extortion. It's enough to bring down the entire Torino organization and expose the network of corruption that protects them. But first, he needs to get Teresa out of Chicago. She's blown her cover to save his life, and Anthony Torino doesn't forgive betrayal. The knock on his door comes at 2 in the morning. Hoover opens it expecting to see Teresa, but instead finds himself face to face with Vincent Torino and 3 armed men. "Mr. Hoover," Vincent says with mock politeness, "my brother would like a word with you." They don't bother with blindfolds or elaborate precautions. In 1913 Chicago, federal agents disappear all the time, and the local police rarely ask inconvenient questions. The basement under Murphy's Tavern smells like stale beer and fresh blood. Teresa is tied to a chair in the corner, her face bruised, her clothes torn. When she sees Hoover being pushed down the stairs, her eyes fill with tears of guilt and despair. "I'm sorry," she whispers. "They said they'd kill my family." Anthony. Torino emerges from the shadows like something out of a nightmare. In the dim light, his face looks corpse pale, his eyes black as coal. "Mr. J. Edgar Hoover," Anthony says, consulting a piece of paper. "Age 24. Born in Washington, D.C., graduated from George Washington University Law School, currently employed by the Justice Department's Alien Enemy Bureau. Officially assigned to investigate German sympathizers in the Chicago area." He crumples up the paper and tosses it aside. "But that's not really why you're here, is it, Mr. Hoover? You're here because you think you can take down Anthony Torino. You think you can waltz into my city, seduce my niece, and destroy everything I've built." Hoover doesn't deny it. Even tied to a chair with a gun pointed at his head, his expression remains calm and calculating. "Your organization is finished, Torino," Hoover says quietly. "I've documented every crime, every payoff, every murder. The evidence is already in Washington. Kill me, and you'll only make things worse for yourself." Anthony laughs, a sound like breaking glass. "Evidence? You mean this evidence?" He signals to one of his men, who produces a suitcase full of papers and photographs. All of Hoover's meticulous documentation stolen from his boarding house room. "Amazing what people will do for money," Anthony muses, setting the suitcase on fire. Mrs. Kowalski sends her regards. As the flames consume months of investigative work, Hoover's composure finally cracks. For the first time, Teresa sees fear in his eyes. "You're making a mistake," Hoover says, his voice rising. "The federal government doesn't forget when one of its agents disappears." "Agent?" Anthony laughs again. You're not an agent, boy. You're a clerk, a nobody. When you don't report back to Washington, they'll assume you got lost in a bottle or ran off with some Chicago floozy. Case closed. He's right, and Hoover knows it. His Chicago investigation was completely unauthorized. As far as the Justice Department knows, he's been dutifully filing reports on German immigrants and attending anti-war rallies. Anthony draws his gun and presses it to Hoover's temple. Any last words, Mr. Federal Agent? That's when the lights go out. The basement plunges into absolute darkness. Shouts echo off the concrete walls as Anthony's men stumble around, trying to find their bearings. Someone fires a gun, the muzzle flash illuminating panicked faces for a split second. In the chaos, Teresa feels someone cutting her bonds. Strong hands pull her to her feet and guide her toward what she hopes is an exit. This way, a voice whispers in her ear. Stay close. It's not Hoover. The voice has a thick Irish accent, and the hands belong to someone much larger than the young federal agent. They emerge from the basement into the tavern's main room, where more figures wait in the darkness. Teresa can make out the shapes of men with guns, positioned to cover every exit. Police! Someone shouts, and suddenly the building is flooded with electric light. Anthony and his men are surrounded by 24 armed officers. But these aren't corrupt Chicago cops on the Torino payroll. These are federal agents, their brass badges gleaming under the harsh bulbs. Leading them is a man Teresa has never seen before, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He surveys the scene with satisfaction before his eyes settle on Hoover, who is still tied to his chair, but very much alive. Agent Hoover, the man says formally, I'm Assistant Director William Flynn. I believe you have something that belongs to us. The rescue was the result of weeks of careful planning. Hoover's unauthorized investigation had indeed caught the attention of his superiors, but not in the way he expected. Instead of being disciplined, he was recruited for a secret program designed to infiltrate and destroy organized crime from within. Flynn explains this to Hoover and Teresa as they sit in a secure hotel room, protected by armed guards and surrounded by the evidence that had supposedly been destroyed in the basement fire. We knew about your Chicago operation from the beginning, Flynn says. Your landlady has been in our employ for 15 years. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence you collected was copied and sent to Washington before you even finished writing your reports. You used me as bait, Hoover realizes. We used you as an investigator, Flynn corrects. The bait was Miss Gianelli here. We knew that if we could turn someone inside the Torino organization, we could bring down the entire network in one coordinated strike. Teresa feels sick. You knew they would discover me. You knew what they would do. Flynn's expression doesn't change. We knew the risks. We also knew that young Agent Hoover here would do everything in his power to protect you. His psychological profile suggested a strong protective instinct toward innocent civilians. Innocent, Teresa laughs bitterly. I've been working for criminals for 3 years. I've helped them launder money, intimidate witnesses, even dispose of bodies. There's nothing innocent about me. But you drew the line at murdering a pregnant woman, Flynn points out. That's when you reached out to us, through Agent Hoover. That's when you became an asset instead of a criminal. The revelation hits Teresa like a physical blow. You've been watching me for 3 years? We've been watching the Torino organization for 5 years, Flynn says calmly. Building cases, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. Your relationship with Agent Hoover provided that moment. Anthony Torino and his associates are arrested that night in a series of coordinated raids across Chicago. The evidence collected during Hoover's investigation, combined with testimony from Teresa and other informants, results in convictions that effectively destroy organized crime's grip on the city. But the victory comes at a cost that will haunt both Hoover and Teresa for the rest of their lives. The official record shows that J. Edgar Hoover spent the winter of 1913 in Washington, D.C., filing routine reports on German immigrant communities. There is no mention of Chicago, no record of the Torino investigation, and certainly no evidence of his romantic involvement with a criminal informant. The photograph that will be discovered a century later is the only proof that any of it happened. Everything else disappears into the classified files of what would eventually become the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Teresa is relocated to San Francisco with a new identity. The Justice Department provides her with a job, a modest apartment, and a fabricated personal history that makes no mention of her time in Chicago. She's told never to contact Hoover again, never to speak of what happened, and never to return to the city where her family still believes she's dead. It's for your own protection, Flynn explains, as she signs document after document, formally agreeing to maintain absolute silence about her role in the investigation. Anthony Torino has friends, even in prison. They won't stop looking for the woman who betrayed them. Hoover, meanwhile, is quietly promoted within the Justice Department hierarchy. His superiors are impressed by his initiative, his analytical skills, and his ruthless efficiency in pursuing criminal targets. But they're also concerned about his emotional involvement with civilian assets. Personal relationships compromise operational security, Flynn warns during Hoover's performance review. In this business, sentiment is a luxury we cannot afford. It's a lesson Hoover takes to heart. When he's appointed director of the Bureau of Investigation 11 years later, he implements strict policies prohibiting romantic relationships between agents and sources. The official justification is operational security, but those who know him best understand the real reason. He's never forgiven himself for putting Teresa in danger, and he's determined that no other agent will face the same impossible choice. Between duty and love, Teresa tries to build a new life in California. She finds work as a secretary for a shipping company, rents a small apartment near Golden Gate Park, and slowly begins to trust that she's safe from Anthony Torino's revenge. But she can't forget Chicago. She can't forget the look in Hoover's eyes when he realized they were both pawns in a larger game. And she can't forget the promise he made to her in that basement just before the lights went out. "Whatever happens," he had whispered, "I'll find you." Years pass. Teresa marries a kind accountant named Robert Chen, changes her name to Charlotte Chen, and has 2 children who never learn about their mother's criminal past. She reads about Hoover's rise through the federal bureaucracy in newspaper articles that never mention his early work in Chicago. But sometimes, late at night when her family is asleep, she takes out a shoebox hidden in the back of her closet. Inside are 3 items that she's kept despite the risk: a photograph of her and Hoover walking by Lake Michigan, a letter he wrote to her just before his transfer back to Washington, and a brass button from his Justice Department coat that came loose during their final meeting. The letter, written in Hoover's precise handwriting, contains words that she's memorized but still reads whenever she needs to remember that she once mattered to someone who would later become one of the most powerful men in America. "My dearest Teresa, I want you to know that what happened between us was real. In the world of lies and deception, what we shared was the only honest thing I've ever experienced. I know they've told you to forget, to move on, to pretend that Chicago never happened, but I will never forget. Someday, when this is all over, I will find you, and when I do, I hope you can forgive me for the choices I made. Forever yours, Edgar." But Hoover never comes. As the years turn into decades, Teresa realizes that the man who wrote those words died in that basement under Murphy's Tavern. The person who emerged was J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, architect of America's modern surveillance state, and one of the most feared figures in government. The final piece of the puzzle doesn't surface until 1972, when Hoover dies in his sleep at the age of 77. His personal effects are seized by the FBI and classified, but a few items slip through the bureaucratic cracks. Among them is a small wooden box containing 3 items: a photograph of a young woman walking by a lake, a brass button from a woman's coat, and a handwritten note that reads, "Charlotte Chen, 1247, Irving Street, San Francisco, California." The note is dated just 3 weeks before Hoover's death, written in the same precise handwriting that Teresa had memorized decades earlier. On the back, in pencil, are 4 words that explain everything. "I never forgot." Maria Santos closes the file and leans back in her chair. The story she's uncovered will never see the light of day. Too many powerful people have too much invested in maintaining the official version of events. Too many families would be destroyed if the truth came out. But she can't let it go completely. Using her connections in the California archives, she tracks down the current residents of 1247 Irving Street in San Francisco. The house has been in the Chen family for over 50 years, now owned by Teresa's granddaughter, Emily Chen Martinez. Maria makes the call on a rainy Thursday afternoon, not sure what she'll say or why she feels compelled to make contact. "Hello," says a warm voice with just a hint of an accent. "Chen Martinez residence. Is this Emily Chen Martinez?" Maria asks. "Yes, how can I help you?" "My name is Maria Santos. I'm a detective in Chicago, and I'm calling about your grandmother, Charlotte Chen." There's a long pause, then in a much quieter voice, "What do you want to know?" "I want to know if she ever talked about a man named J. Edgar Hoover." Another pause, longer this time. "She left me a letter," Emily says finally. "She told me that someday someone might call asking that exact question. She said if they did, I should tell them that she forgave him. She forgave him, but she never forgot." "Did she say anything else?" "She said to tell whoever asked that the photograph they found was taken on the last day. She was truly happy, and that if they really understood what happened in Chicago, they'd know that some secrets are worth keeping." Maria hangs up the phone and looks again at the century-old photograph. 5 gangsters posing outside a tavern, unaware that their empire is about to crumble. And in the background, barely visible through a dirty window, a young man with glasses and a notebook, already calculating how to use their downfall to build his own legacy of power. The official files will remain classified. The photograph will be returned to its box in the archives. And the true story of J. Edgar Hoover's first case will remain buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and official denial. But Teresa Gianelli's granddaughter will keep her letter, just as Teresa kept her photograph. Because some stories are too important to forget, even when they're too dangerous to tell. In the margins of American history, in the spaces between the official record and the truth, love and betrayal dance their eternal dance. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone remembers that the monsters who shape our world were once young enough to fall in love, and human enough to break their own hearts in service to a greater cause. The photograph remains, silent witness to a moment when the future director of the FBI was just a young man with a notebook, trying to save the world one criminal at a time. Before the power, before the paranoia, before the legacy of surveillance and control that would define his career, there was Chicago. There was Teresa. There was a love story that history chose to forget. But photographs don't lie, and sometimes that's enough.